Good morning, friends. This is UGC CEC live lecture series, and we are running a series of lectures which is titled World Literature. And this world literature is a new concept. It appeared recently, and it means that the world is one, humanity is one, and that there are no divisions anywhere, potentially at least. So, with this in view, we have planned this series to talk about different literatures in languages, in countries, in geographical other regions and all. And today we will be talking about Syrian poetry, and it's a place quite close to us, and it is much in the news these days. But we should know as to what is happening in Syria at the level of poetry and literature in general. For this lecture, we have today the expert Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English literature in Delhi University, and she has worked on literary theory, on Indian writing, and she has published papers and published books also. Before I request her to begin her lecture, let me tell you, friends, that the last 10 minutes of this lecture, which will start at 10:50, you can also participate in the discussion. You can raise questions, and Dr. Richa Bajaj would be glad to respond to them. And the toll-free number that you can use for this is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, 1-800-110-430. So, without taking more time, let me request Dr. Richa Bajaj, welcome, and please give your lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Anand Prakash. And viewers, today we are going to discuss Syrian poetry and look at the conditions in Syria that have given rise to this kind of poetry, this kind of new kind of poetry that is available to us. And in this regard, I am going to take up the poet Maram al-Masri. She's one of the most captivating feminine voice, of modern Arabic literature. So, just discussing, reading out some of her poems and acquaint you with that side of life, and also to that new kind of literature that is emerging in Syria, particularly, in the period following the Arab Spring. And this is then, and just discussing, with reference to a couple of, I'll also be referring to a memoir of sorts, which is called The Crossing by Samar Yazbek, and just to give you a view of how life is lived in Syria. So, before we begin, we come to the poetry part of the lecture. Let's try to understand the historical dynamism of the region and the Middle East. I mean, by the region I mean Middle East. Let's try and understand what really happened in Syria. Why there is so much. You must have heard, even till today, the other day there was news on Syria about war crisis, about interventions of foreign players, etc. So just going back into the history, which is not like even it's not far off. We are talking about 2010 or 11. That's the period that we are speaking of. Now, the term Arab Spring that we generally apply to, a set of writing, or a cult, or a movement that began in late 2010 and came in a big way in 2011. It started in, why we call it a spring, is another thing which I'll come to. So, protests basically started in Tunisia, which is a part of North Africa, Middle East, that section. So protests started in Tunisia against the authoritative government of the time, against the oppressive regimes that were both socially and at the same time economically oppressive and exploitative in nature, that left that was a place that was marked by corruption and unemployment, injustice of all sorts. So you see, people rose against these injustices, and there were protests. People came out on the streets, and there were people from all walks of life, again children, the youth, the older generation, the educated lot, people who were meant to enter the high profile jobs, even they entered and became a part of these protests. And so what happened was that in Tunisia, protests, people took to the streets, and they took out protests, and the images of these protests were shown on social media, and people became more aware that it became a kind of a raging fire after that. In fact, one after the other, the nations caught on with this kind of movement in their own countries, and from you saw that from Tunisia, there's Libya, Egypt, all of them were taken over by these uprisings. So civil uprisings and these kind of this rage of the people, the anger of the people got reflected in these movements in their respective countries. So you see, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, and Kuwait, Lebanon, Morocco, Jordan, so many countries got affected by what we call the Arab Spring. And that there were so many movements in these countries going on simultaneously, catching on from and inspired by one another, in fact. So what happened in Tunisia somehow inspired people in both Egypt and Libya, so much so that what finally took shape, what finally happened, what resulted, what we call the Arab Spring, that it was a kind of a revolution. The word spring is often used as a kind of a revolution that took place in these different places. So in Tunisia, the Abedin Ben Ali government was toppled, the leader was exiled, ousted. In Egypt, you had Hosni Mubarak, who was also ousted, and we know the fate. Libya saw Gaddafi killed mercilessly in this kind of, and which also led to a civil war. In Yemen, you had Abdullah Saleh, who was ousted, and the shift of power took place. In Syria, the regime of Assad, which is Bashar al-Assad, is saw this kind of uprising, but it tried to quash it. It tried to crush the movement, and so Assad continued to remain the leader and the president of the country despite uprisings that took shape in that time. I'll come back to Syria, but then in Bahrain and in Kuwait and Lebanon, Oman, Morocco, Jordan, all these places also saw uprisings, but very soon the governments of these places realized that they cannot, they will see the fate of Hosni Mubarak or a Gaddafi if they don't include reforms in their countries, and so they took to bringing in reforms and bettering the conditions of the people, and therefore a revolution was averted, the conditions of a revolution were averted, and they were able to contain and they were able to suppress these movements within their countries. Also, we have to remember that the Saudi Arabia played an important role as a foreign player that backed the governments and sent them supplies, and so that their rule and their dictatorships remain. So so what is happening, it's in a state of turmoil, it's in a complete state of turbulence, this place, this entire region, the Middle East that we call, or the Arab world as we call it, that saw this kind of Arab Spring, that saw revolutions one after the other unfolding, and people overthrowing the governments, ousting the leaders, killing the leaders, sending them in exile. So it created this kind of space for an alternate model to come in. What happened, what the result of Arab Spring then was that the Arab Spring created a kind of a power vacuum. Now, when I say it created a kind of power vacuum, what I mean to say is that one government was ousted and exiled, but who was going to take its place? How were they going to fill that space? How would they see to it that a proper democratic process takes place and a democratic government comes to the fore? Now, that power vacuum actually gave rise to multiple factions coming to the fore in all these countries, and because multiple factions, multiple groups came over and they tried to grab power. Now, think of who all came. They were the religious elite groups who thought that this was their right opportunity and they could grab the opportunity to and stake their claim on the country. Along with that, and this is quite similar in most countries, because all these countries, after they oust their dictator, they are left in a kind of a power vacuum, or they are taken towards a kind of a civil war. In fact, Tunisia is the only place that has been able to establish a democracy among all these countries that we are talking about. Everywhere else, there is a kind of still this kind of instability that is present till date as we speak. So you see, what I'm trying to say here is that there was a kind of a revolution. The early phase of Arab Spring brought in a lot of hopes and aspirations to the people who thought that, you know, this was the time where they are going to fight for their rights and they will be able to get a new system or a new government in place that will work for them, work for the people, that will ensure jobs, that would ensure employability, that would ensure justice, and also get rid of the ills that they were faced with. But what happened in its place when they ousted the leader, there was a kind of a power vacuum created, and in this power vacuum then you saw many groups come to the fore and stake claims. Among these were the religious groups that I spoke of. Also there were other sectarian ethnic groups that laid their claim or to form governments. And yet you see, talking now specifically about Syria, this was a kind of a larger view that I was trying to give you, but talking specifically about Syria and what takes place. You see, the protests were there, inspired by the Arab Spring. There were protests also in Syria, but they were crushed by the Assad regime, and they were suppressed. To an extent that people were killed, civilians were killed, you know, mass kind of a massacres took place in Syria at the time. But this gave rise to other things, because Assad's regime became very dictatorial and violent in extremes and went to extremes. So you saw the emergence of several other groups. One of them was this Free Syrian Army that came to the fore. Now what was this Free Syrian Army really that we are speaking of? This Free Syrian Army were defectors who left the army, who left the government army, and they rebelled against it and formed their own army, which was called then the Free Syrian Army, which was fighting and was aimed to overthrow the government. So imagine the number of groups that and the players that are involved in this particular exercise. Along with that, there were sectarian differences in Syria, which till now were not stirred, but because of rabble rousing and everything, you saw that these sectarian groups also tried to lay claim to forming a separate state, or becoming or fighting with one another. So on one hand there was the Free Syrian Army, which was called the FSA, which tried to topple the government, and so it was an alternate section of society. Then there was the Syrian Army, which was trying to fight all the insurgency in the country, in Syria, the government Syrian Army. And this Syrian Army, I will also come back to the foreign players. So there is the Free Syrian Army, there is the government Syrian Army. Along with that, there were the Kurdish rebel groups, and the Kurdish is again an ethnic group that is there in Turkey and in Syria. So they also tried to, and they were constantly in fight with other groups in the country. Along with that, what came to the fore, or what tried to gain a foothold or occupy the regions of Syria in this time of crisis, was the group, the Islamic State ISIS group, which had gained a major territory in Iraq and had completely taken that country in its grips. Now when we speak of Syria, we have to remember how strategically, what kind of place where it is placed. So on its eastern side you actually have Iraq, on its northern side it has Turkey, and it is occupied by countries that also have some kind of some benefits to draw from Syria, and it wants to extend their own rules in this region. So you see, from Iraq the ISIS came to Syria, and they were able to occupy certain northern eastern belt of Syria as well. And on the other hand, you had Turkish troops, you had Turkey trying to make inroads in trying to gain control over Syria and fighting against this Assad regime. So how many groups have come to the fore. Then there was one Hezbollah group, which was an Iran backed group that was also there. Finally there was the Syrian Democratic Party, or the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is called the SDF in Syria, which was fighting for democracy. So many groups in Syria till date are trying to gain that space, are trying to occupy the country, or at least gain a kind of control over the country. and each one. Now this was within Syria. Now if we come out of Syria, we realize that there are regional players who also have stakes in what is happening in Syria. They also want to benefit from it, or they would like their own power to be extended in these regions. So you have on the one hand you have forces. Now what we have to remember is that Syria is largely the Muslim Sunni country, and but the security government, or the authority to which Assad belongs to, the family he belongs to, is the Alawites, and they are the Shia Alawite sect. Which the sectarian there are different sects, the different Muslim sects, and they have different ethos and different religious practices, and so therefore countries which are majority Sunni Muslims, they would stand against the Assad regime, and they were backing then the Free Syrian Army, the rebel group in the country, and they were backing these countries because they wanted a Sunni government to come to the fore, and they wanted to get rid of a Shia Alawite like Assad. So the countries like Turkey and other Gulf areas you had, who were in favor of removing Assad, they tried to back the Free Syrian Army, and then there were those who were in favor of Assad, who were supporting Assad in his endeavor and trying to back his government. So you see, so the majority Shia Iran and Iraq and Lebanon based Hezbollah, these supported Assad, and the Sunni majority countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, they were anti-Assad, and they were also then supporting the anti-Assad rebels. So you see so much of chaos really, and so many and such complex layers at which you have to see how these sections of society are fighting, siding with one another at one time, then fighting amongst one another, and also fighting with the government. So this was about the regional players as far as the concern of religion or sect is concerned. Now it's not limited there. So let's try to understand what we are doing. We are trying to understand the conditions, the groups, the factions which exist within Syria, the many rebel groups, the many ethnic groups that are there within Syria. Then we try to broaden our scope to include other neighboring countries, and what kind of role are they playing in Syria, how they are trying to benefit, how they are trying to increase their power and exacerbate that as against other groups. The third category, and as things become broader and we look at it from the world level, is where the international foreign players who are away from that region still are at loggerheads with one another because of Syria. Now you have the Free Syrian Army. Now there is conflict in Syria, and it's affecting the world at large. You have the United States that is backing the Free Syrian Army. In fact, there were news that the CIA, it was documented that the CIA tried to train some of the Free Syrian Army rebels, but it had put in a lot of money, and therefore it stopped that exercise. But the idea is that the United States has entered this war in Syria. On the other hand, you have Russia, who's also entered the war and is supporting the Assad's regime. So it necessarily, the moment you see two groups fighting against one another in Syria, you have the big wiggies and the international players such as the United States and Russia also enter that domain. And and just recently in 2018 itself, you saw how United States had bombed certain places, how Russia was also playing a part, how centers in Syria were being bombed. Now who is at the receiving end? Of course, these countries are fighting one another with one another, and they are countering one another at the world level, and entering the Syrian crisis. But what is being done to abet this kind of a situation? What is being done to what corrective measures are being taken? That is the larger question. You see, when now coming back, so this was the levels at which this kind of conflict has risen. In fact, one of the news articles on Al Jazeera says that this is the most, this is the 20th century Syrian crisis, which has gone on for for so many years, has actually it is of a very great proportion and almost like a world war situation, and has gone on more than the world wars, and one doesn't see a resolution coming in place. So you see, the idea is that what happens to people on the ground, how do they respond and reconcile with this kind of reality, where all they see if US is striking and if Russia is striking and there are bombs there you see every day on the Syrian sky, then what is the life at home in Syria? Now, coming back to the region, coming back to the life that you see in Syria, what happened when Arab Spring became very fierce in its movements, when the Syrian protests also became very, very fierce. It was at this time that Assad's counter attacks became intensified, and that kind of crackdown on the people, the civilian population, it intensified further, so much so that there was in one instance, and there are many such instances you will find all over the internet. There was one instance on news channels, if you browse them, and heart-wrenching instances that are available. There were these 15 boys who were detained and tortured just because they wrote graffiti in support of Arab Spring. And that kind of created an atmosphere of a chilling atmosphere, because they were all put behind bars and tortured. One of the boys, in fact, who was a 13-year-old boy, Hamza al-Khatib, he was he was imprisoned, but then he was brutally tortured and mutilated and castrated, and pictures and videos of his body surfaced all over at the time, and that created this kind of a death-like atmosphere in the country. And nobody had seen violence of this sort, this kind of visceral kind of bodily details that came to the fore, that kind of violence that was being done to people. It was heart-wrenching. And this kind of torture of children then went on a large scale in Syria, and this is the life at home. So I'm giving this instance just so you understand what life is in Syria. This is also, when this boy comes back, the body is given back, then it is bullet ridden all over, and there are lacerations all over on the body of the person. So you see, this is just one example of the many instances and the life that is there in Syria. And this at this point, actually, I'll just take up Samar Yazbek's account of Syria, that she's a journalist, and both these writers that I'm going to talk about, they are women writers, and so I wanted to look at Syria from a woman's point of view, because then things get a different perspective. Not to say, even there are other writers who've done brilliant work on this field, but because of paucity of time, I thought of just taking these. So Samar Yazbek was born in 1970 in Syria, and she studied literature, then began her career as a journalist, and translated certain works also, and wrote a series for television, etc. But she went on exile. She was forced to go into exile and leave Syria, and so she went and settled in Paris. And Maram al-Masri, whose poetry I'm going to read out today to you, she is also a Syrian-born woman. She was born in 1962, but she had to go in exile, leave Syria, and she too settled in Paris. So these similar kind of movements of women who are able to write this literature, who are able to speak their minds, they could only do that when they could maintain that distance from that situation where there's no scope for expression. So in any case, you see, let me give you some quotes as to what Syria is like to Samar Yazbek here. And she says, and I quote from the book which is called The Crossing, and here she says, let me quote it from the book: "The sky was on fire. It felt like I was being bombarded with frenetic images competing for my attention. To take it all in, I needed eyes in the back of my head, on my ears, hell, even on my fingertips. Staring ahead, I tried to make sense of my surroundings. Machines of destruction, the blazing sky, a solitary car carrying one woman and 4 men heading through the olive groves to the town of Sarake. So you see, this is unquote. This is what she sees. So the sky is always on fire, and there is this is the image of Syria that she has, and this is where she's trying to talk about the life of armed militants with victory banners, and in another instance she says, I quote, "Everywhere I looked there were armed militants, victory banners. I tried to take snapshots in my mind of what I could see as I stretched my head out of the car window, detaching myself emotionally from my surroundings." Unquote. You see, this is Syria. This is the Syria that one is talking about. There are so many armed rebellions and militant groups that have taken taken a share of that land. And when Samar Yazbek begins her narrative, then the first line, is chilling. In fact, let me read that out to you, how she begins. It starts with August 2012. "The barbed wire lacerated my back." That's the first line of her work. And again, the idea of violence, that the barbed wire lacerated my back, it has made a deep wound in her back. It's not just a cut, it's a very deep wound that she's talking about. So that's the beginning, and this is just the beginning of how she will unfold the drama of Syria through 2012, and to include how different players have been acting in this entire episode. Now, also, trying to look at how then this kind of world is looked at by the outside world. Now, Christina Lamb, who is actually the author of I Am Malala, she has written a foreword to the book. And in the foreword, very interestingly, she says that, and I quote, "Seen through the new lens of refugees and terrorists, sometimes it's easy to forget that Syria is a country of ordinary people trying to live their lives, of girls trying to read bedtime stories to their baby sisters while sheltering from bombs, and mums and dads trying to work and feed their families as war grinds on." So you see that kind of contrast, that life they're trying to live out, trying to get a space for normalcy where there is none. Your surroundings are far from normal, and yet a family tries to lead a normal life. Also underlining the impossibility. Why I'm reading from Lamb's foreword is because I also want to have an outsider's view on the Middle East, and especially a Westerner's view on the Middle East, how that looks. Again, let me read this out to you. I quote, "This book will remind you of the initial hope of 2011 and the Arab Spring. The earnestness of the early revolutionaries who wanted democracy is heartbreaking, and their warnings of how their fight might be hijacked by well-funded extremists if they continue to get no Western help are horribly prescient." Unquote. So, viewers, I'd like to leave you with this thought as to how these rebellions, these groups are all well funded, and how they have hijacked a movement that was supposed to bring in revolution but did not.
Friends, this is the first part of the lecture, and in this part, Dr. Richa Bajaj has talked about the complexity of the situation, and she has brought in different social formations that became active in the wake of Arab Spring and created what is called a very complex situation, a very confused state of affairs. And how do writers negotiate this, how they make sense of it, how they can afford to say something nice and positive about it, is the question that most of the writers would have faced. And in the second part, Dr. Richa Bajaj would be talking about poets responding to the situation in their own characteristic style. So till then, you have to wait. Thank you. Welcome back, friends. This is the second part of the lecture. In the first part, Dr. Bajaj talked about the situation which was very problematic in Syria and the neighboring countries. Not only that, at the world level, and this was born as a weight by the literature of the time, and manifestations of such a literature they will be shared further by Dr. Bajaj in the second part of the lecture. So please come back and give the next information regarding this.
Thank you, Dr. Prakash. Viewers, now I will focus on the poetry of Maram al-Masri. She is a Syrian poet born in Latakia in 1962. It's a Mediterranean coastal city where she grew up, and she studied English literature at the Damascus University, and she began publishing her poetry in different magazines from 1970s or so, and finally in 1987 her first poetry collection came to the fore. It was titled A Red Cherry on a White Tiled Floor. Following that, there are two other collections which have come out. One is titled The Barefoot Souls, which recently came out in 2009, and the next is Liberty Walks Naked, which some of the poems from there have been translated into English. Now, Maram al-Masri initially she wrote in Arabic, so she writes in Arabic and is fluent with French and also in English. But most of these works that you see are available, they are not written in English, they have been written in the Arabic and have been translated into English for us. Now, so she's a Syrian poet who has again, so she was born in 1962, she was there, she grew up in Syria, but then in 1992 she moved to Paris, and since then she's been there. But so there is a kind of a diaspora then, she belongs to that the exiled lot of Syria whose heart is in Syria and yet they're living their lives somewhere else. So there is that kind of a diasporic identity in her works that you notice. However, I would like to talk about the concerns of Maram al-Masri, because I find her poetry absolutely refreshing in the present times, and you notice that Syrian poetry is remarkably different in these couple of decades that have from 1980s and 90s onwards to especially written in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the first decade of the 21st century. So you find that there is this kind of violence which is, again, as I said, of this visceral quality. There is pain, there is war, and there is this sense of gathering oneself even in the midst of chaos. So this is very new kind of literature, very refreshing kind of literature that you see, and Maram al-Masri is a representative voice of that new literature that has come to the fore from Syria. Now, let me read out straight away to you some of the poems of Maram al-Masri, where you will see how she is trying to negotiate this kind of life as it is lived out in ground zero in Syria, and what she has to say about that. The first poem that I'd like to read out, is and she doesn't give titles to her poems, they're just numbered one after the other. So I'm reading. On the wall of the school playground, the word freedom was written in white chalk by small children's fingertips. On the walls of history, freedom has penned their names with blood. That's the first poem. On the walls of the school playground, the word freedom was written in white chalk by small children's fingertips. On the walls of history, freedom has penned their names with blood. So imagine, what their lives were supposed to, these poems, the figure of the child is somehow very dear to Masri, and she constantly uses that when she's talking about Syria, the homeland, the place. And when she talks about children, suddenly it's a very heartbreaking image, in fact, where you see that they wrote the word freedom with white chalk, and now on the walls of history has written their names in blood. That's their fate. Their death she's referring to here. Let me read out the other poem which is also on the child, and it says, have you seen him? He was carrying his child in his arms, walking quickly on his way, his head held high, his back straight. How this child could have been happy and proud to be carried thus in his father's arms, if only he was alive. Unquote. You see, so that this father what is he? Is he full of pride for this kind of war, or what is the trauma of the father here and this child who was meant to be alive? If only he was alive, he would have been happy and proud of his father who's carrying him in his arms. So the figure, these are more pictures. If you just look at them, these poems have a very strong visual quality about them. And this goes on. Another poem, I quote, my son is beautiful, my son is a hero, and the dictator is jealous of heroes. My son is a hero, and he is my love, the light of my eyes, my soul. She walks around, she shows him to those whose eyes are downcast. On her arms lies her son, smiling within the frames of a picture. Unquote. So the son is actually not present there, not physically present there. It's the picture, it's the photograph of her son that she's carrying in her arms and showing it to people. So you see, you expect an alive, happy child in the arms of parents, and what you have, how she turns this entire narrative into is this of death, of children's death, and they being carried by their parents. And another one on children that I'm quoting here, I'm going to read out. The children of Syria are shrouded in their coffin, like sugar candy in its wrapping. But they are not made of sugar, they are flesh, love, and a dream. The roads await you, the gardens await you, the schools and the festive squares await you, children of Syria. It is so early for you to become birds of heaven and to play in the sky. Unquote. You see, so the fate of children of Syria who are shrouded in their coffin, and again the image, again taken from childhood, they are like sugar candies in wrappings. Again, that's this kind of effect that it creates. It's kind of this kind of a numb feeling that it leaves one with is there. And another poem from this section of where she's talking about the voices, the suffering of people. And I quote, I am a human being, not an animal, shouted citizen Ahmad Abdul Wahab. He filled television screens with his broken voice, like a captive who has escaped his jail. He escapes, having broken the chains of fear and silence. The veins in his neck bulge. his eyes drown in anger. In his lifetime, he never read Balzac or Victor Hugo. He knows not Lenin or Karl Marx. At that time, at that moment, the ordinary citizen became extraordinary." Unquote. So, again, telling, also suggesting that extraordinariness is something not that comes with reading, education, or by the political labels that you attach to yourself. It comes from within, and that anger and that suffering makes ordinary people into extraordinary figures. So, taking examples from specimens from these kind of images and from the life that is lived there and talking about them. Again, another one on children, and I'll just quote two more on this one. She says, "Children of freedom don't wear their clothes from the white company. Their skin has become accustomed to harsh material. The children of freedom wear second-hand clothes. Their shoes are sizes too big to fit for the coming year, and often they wear only their nudity and scars. Children of freedom don't know the taste of bananas or strawberries, and don't eat chocolate biscuits, only dry bread dunked in the water of patience. In the evening, the children of freedom do not take a warm bath and don't play with the colored balls of soap. They play with rubber tires, tin boxes, and remnants of bombs. Before sleeping, the children of freedom do not brush their teeth and don't listen to stories of princes and princesses. They only hear the silence of cold and fear. On the pavements, in refugee camps, or in graves, like all children, the children of freedom await their dear mother." Unquote. This poem brings so much to us, how you expect children to lead this kind of life and how they are playing. It's highly ironic that they are playing not with toys but with remnants of bombs. And with tin boxes. Again, that kind of life that is full of dust, that is full, that the life in refugee camps, and how they're taken to their graves, how they wait for their mothers who are never going to return. So all those insecurities and fears come to the fore, and are suggested by the writer here. There's one more I'm going to read on the same kind of which has the same feel to it, and it's on Syria. "She arrives naked to the mountains and plains in Syria and in the refugee camps. Her feet sink in mud, her hands crack from the cold, but she moves forward. She crosses, her children clinging to her arms. They fall as she runs. She suffers and she cries, but she moves forward. She breaks her leg, but she moves forward. They slit her throat, but she continues to sing. Tell me a story," said the boy, born in Syrian prison to a mother who has been raped. Unquote. You see, again, this is the figure of the woman in Syria, or Syria herself. Like, Syria is also seen as a woman, and very close to the poem where she talks about where liberty she walks naked. There again she talks about Syria and visualizes Syria as a feminine subject who is in that sense unstoppable, and even with a slit throat she is going to keep walking. So this sense that she continues to sing, it is Syria that she is actually talking and visualizing in the feminine body, and talking about that concern of hers. And this goes on, this kind of poetry is one kind of poetry that Maryam al-Masri writes, and this is basically talking about the ravages of war, the kind of the effect that it has on the lives of people, how lives are lost each day, and how the pain and suffering of that community and the country at large is one very important strain in Maryam al-Masri's works, which is to do with war. And at this point, I'd actually invite Dr. Anand Prakash's comment on this kind of war poetry or anti-war poetry that she writes before I move to the love poetry of Maryam al-Masri.
Well, actually, I would appreciate what you said about the poems. and about the reality which is posing these issues to the poets. The first thing is that Syria is a country, as you say, Syria is a woman, Syria is a child, but Syria also, as you suggested in the beginning, is the world.
Right.
Because Syria is surrounded by neighbors, and each neighbor has a different set of interests. Then you have the world around, Russia, America and all the big countries. They are involved in it. So whenever there is a little flare up in Syria, then that becomes a world question, that becomes a world concern. And so that this in the world literature series, I think this is the locus standi of world literature, that this literature belongs to us as much as it belongs to Syria.
It is important for us to understand this kind of literature, because so much is happening on that side, and so much is happening. I mean, things that you think things are normal, and you seem to think sitting at in one's own country, you think that there you hear sense of boredom, etc. But that life, there is no space for boredom.
Aren't we directly involved with this reality? Is the question?
Directly or indirectly?
Directly,
and there are not bombs falling on our country, and bombing our house, taking away our
those
family.
Bombs might have been made in some other country.
Yeah.
Workers would be involved in that. Political regimes are involved. If Russia and America are involved, all the neighbors are involved, I think it is happening to us.
But then war is also a kind of market. You're suggesting that it's a market that the leaders of the world, or the imperialistic nations, or those groups would not want it to cease, and they would want to continue war.
What about the whole world as a market? Following the market logic and becoming one unified in the negative sense. It could be also positive. The whole world could be one, but here
not making bombs.
Not making bombs. Yes, exactly. And then the final image that you have very rightly emphasized is the image of the woman. The woman represents the modern humanity at the world level, and that's why this poet becomes very, very significant for us.
Even the male poets in Syria, you will often see that their images too are taken from children's and the innocent lives that have been sacrificed. Even when there are portrayals of men, they are very sensitive men who are catering to, say, animals. Even when their own place is being bombed, they are still making shelter homes for animals. So there, in a way, the sensitivity of the person gets highlighted, and not even the gender binaries. At that stage they are neither male or female, and they become those sensitive human beings who are trying to shelter, preserve what is there, and also cry when a child is bandaged and left to die.
Suppose I say suffering is the binding factor.
Yes, certainly suffering is, and suffering evokes that kind of humanity and that kind of intense human feeling among these subjects. And so I also, when I read some male writers from the region, I didn't find that so to speak, within quotes, that male characteristic of poetry in them. Their poetry is very close to the female subject as well, in that sense, when they're talking about the sufferings of war.
So direction of suffering is not towards the males, it is towards the suffering people who are mostly
people.
Women.
Yes, women, yes. So in that sense, that is an important strain in Maram al-Masri. And about war and poetry, since we are discussing the subject, what does Maram al-Masri have to say about her own poetry, or about the role of poetry in one's time? And she says, I quote from her prose passage, she says at one place, even if people usually think that poetry is unable to change the world, to prevent wars, misery and racism, the poets think, believe, and more than that, know that the words, especially the art of words, which is poetry, are powerful. Poetry is not a weapon but a medicine. Poetry has the power to promote beauty, tenderness, solidarity and love between human beings. It can cure the wounds. Poetry is a very weak woman, but the world lies on the shoulder of women. Unquote. You know how she is able to portray that poetry is, and again poetry becomes the woman subject. Poetry is woman, just as Syria is woman. Here poetry, she says, poetry is a very weak woman, but the world lies on the shoulder of women. The way forward, as she sees it, is through the role that women can play.
Why does she say poetry is not a weapon?
Yes, you see, she says that in fact, again, she's saying that, you know, I don't want to, again, maybe this has something to do with the psychology of war itself that leaves people with such strains that they do not wish to use even attributes and metaphors which are related to weapon and war. So she says that poetry is not weapon to be used in any war. Poetry is in fact anti-war. And for that reason, it is not, I would not like to see it as a weapon that kills or that is meant to harm others. You understand? The very category of when you say something is a weapon, then you are saying that it is meant to kill somebody, it is meant to shoot somebody. But she says that for her, she doesn't see poetry as that something that is meant to harm or kill another human being.
But a medicine.
But a medicine
which would
that
heal.
that can heal. So you know, the whole terminology of war and weaponry is something that she's trying to avoid.
So she's calling literature a human endeavor, a humanist endeavor.
Yeah, and that is not meant to harm people with a knife or any other weapon. So she refuses to see poetry in that light. In fact, she goes on to say that, I quote, "Poetry is always a way of breaking walls between people. It is a way to create a sensible communication between different souls. Above the borders, the distance, differences of language and beliefs, poetry makes us nobler and more human with a big H." You know, and that's how she portrays, unquote, that's how she portrays poetry in her view of things. Now, friends, I'd like to, in this given time, I'd like to just give you a slice of her love poetry as well. Again, very refreshing take on love relationships, lies, truths about marriage, how she views this kind of a world. And what she says about lies and truth is very interesting. In one of her poems, she says, and I quote, "Give me your lies, I will wash them and tuck them into the innocence of my heart to make them facts," unquote. You know, what is she suggesting? That give me your lies, I know you are lying to me, I will wash them and tuck them into the innocence of my heart to make them facts, unquote. So you know, that kind of a image that she's creating, that you know, I will wash away it, even if it is a lie that you're giving me, I would want to believe that lie. You know, and the way she says it is something very you know, interesting. In fact,
what is the innocence of heart? Why is innocence of heart required? I mean, according to her, how would you respond to this? Innocence of heart means that there is nothing before it, and that she is ready to accept whatever comes from the lover. Yeah. And that will strike root.
Yeah, innocence of heart also in the sense of the fool, because you know, when she writes her poetry, again, this might give you a clue why the heart is innocent in her scheme of things. She says, "How foolish! Whenever my heart hears a knocking, it opens its doors," unquote. You know, so the foolishness of heart, the innocence of heart, that it whenever it hears a knocking, it opens its doors, that it believes. It is also in that sense naive, the heart for her.
Shakespeare's Rosalind comes to mind. She says some such thing. She is a very well-read poet.
Yeah, of course. She's in fact talking often in her poetry about Victor Hugo and others, and she's a student of literature, Balzac as well. So that continues to be an influence on her poetry. And in another poem, she says, and this is on desire and morals. What is her take on that? I quote, "Desire inflames me, and my eyes glimmer. I stuff morals in the nearest drawer. I turn into the devil and blindfold my angels just for a kiss," unquote. So you know, the kind of tussle that one has, that is there between desire and morals. She says, the morals, I stuff the morals in the nearest drawer in my cupboard, and I turn into the devil and I blindfold my angels just so I can indulge in my desires. So you know, there is a kind of a freeness or free take on relationships, and also on marriage. You know, her take is very different or very new, because you know, when she's talking, then say in marriage, where she talks about, she also refers to the breakdowns in marriage that take place. But it was very refreshing for me to see that she has written a poem on the other woman in her husband's life. Sorry, not in her husband's life, but the other woman in her lover's life, who's actually the wife. So, she's talking to her lover and telling him that, treat your wife the way you treat me. And that's where I thought this newness comes in, and where the other woman is not necessarily your adversary, or you're not supposed to have a hate relationship with that other woman, who is probably, she's seeing the other woman as a victim. While she sees herself as a victim, she also sees the beloved, she sees the wife also as a victim here. And let me read out to you what she says. At night, take her by the waist, kiss her throat as you kiss me, and wipe with your hands the fatigue of her exhausting day. Tell her, for me, that she is as beautiful and desirable as on the day you met her. Make love to her the way you make love to me, until her silent birds begin to chirp, the woman who is my adversary. Unquote. So you see,
a kind of bonding of one woman with another.
And not necessarily because of a man not necessarily seeing the relationship as antagonistic or as one which is fraught with this kind of hatred. She's actually bonding with the other woman and advising the man to see her.
Kind to.
Yes. So there is this sense which is very different and refreshing in her poetry, in fact. And what is her take on marriage? Let's look at that. He wanted no more than this, a house, children, and a wife who loved him. But he woke up one day and found that his spirit had grown old. She wanted no more than this, a house, children, and a husband who loved her. She woke up and one day found that her spirit had opened a window and fled. Unquote.
Because young.
Yes.
Unlike the husband who will become old.
Oh yes. I'm open to interpretations. But I also noted a streak of magic realism here.
Yes.
Very close to where the woman's spirit opens a window and flies away.
Leaves this world.
Leaves the house.
Yes.
All those things. So very also has a magic there's an element of magic realism in there that she talks about. But another one on marriage. If I can just read that out, I quote, because between us there is no warm soup to eat and lukewarm words to repeat. Because between us there is no longer anything except a bed where only mushrooms grow, and night that does not erase the weariness of the day. Because between us there is nothing but children whom we serve our delusions on a plate. Because we have become more polite than strangers and less than enemies in our mutual admiration. Because between us there are no longer any unbridled laughters and innocent touches and the taste of bay leaves and honey on our lips. Because between us there is no longer, and it is left incomplete. Unquote.
Basically, social constructions coming in the realm of nature.
Exactly, and also how this entire institution of marriage, family is a sham. That you serve delusions on a plate, to your children, and you nurture those things that you have stopped believing in yourself. So there is this kind of a take on marriage as well that she is able to provide.
Well, viewers, we come to the end of the lecture. And the end actually is on the doors of happiness, on the doors of freedom, on the doors of nature, desire as is called. And this poet has been longing for this in a world which is riven with all kinds of conflicts. So in this conflicting situation, in a very deadly world, we have some hope from human relationships. That's what the poet seems to be sending out as a message, and I think it's a very positive message in the world today. So in this lecture we have learnt about the situation that exists in the world today, the way people suffer in different countries, the way they come together through childhood, through the depiction of women, through the depiction of love and things like that, where bonding is more important, freedom is more important than anything else. So I think it's a lecture that is useful for us, and we can surely learn lessons from this Syrian poet and from the Syrian experience in general. Thank you, And thank you, viewers, and then there will be another lecture next time. Thanks.